In the mid to late 300 AD, there was a man by the name of Jerome. Jerome was a brilliant scholar who knew both Greek and Hebrew. And in fact, he had spent some 14 years in the town of Bethlehem in order to study Hebrew through a Jewish rabbi. He was commissioned by Damasus, who was pope at that time, to make a new translation of the scriptures into Latin. There was a lot of confusion going on during that time because people were translating the Bible into Latin, but there's bits and pieces all over the place. So Jerome got as many of the transcripts as that he could find, and he got them together, and he created a fantastic work called the Latin Vulgate. And it would be the standard translation for the Roman Catholic Church for many, many, many years. Now, the first one to translate any kind of scripture whatsoever into English was by a man named Caedmon. Caedmon was a monk who loved the animals and loved working in the stables. And he hated music, of all things. And so one night he had a dream. And when he had a dream, he was told that he was to put scripture to song. And so Caedmon woke up that morning and became England's very first poet as he put scripture to music. Then we have Bede, who was a monk and a scholar. He put some of the portions of scripture into Old English. Alfred the Great translates some of the Psalms into English. And Aldred, who was the Bishop of Durham, he translates part of the Bible into Northumbrian, which is a dialect of the Old English in between the lines of the Lindisfarne Gospels. Then, for many, many years, there's not a real move toward getting the Bible into English. The Catholic Church solidifies its stance at this point that the Bible is to only be written in Latin, read in Latin, studied in Latin. It's all about Latin. However, a man by the name of John Wycliffe believed that everybody should have the Bible in their own language to be able to read it and to study it and to understand it. So he inspired a group of men to get together and to start translation of the Bible into what is called Middle English. And so they did a fantastic work. Of course, as you can imagine, the church was not very happy about his work. And so he was tried and found guilty of spreading seditiousness and heresy. And then 40 years after he had died, they dug up his bones. They tried him for heresy, excommunicated him, dug up his bones, burned them, and spread his ashes into the river Swift, which poured out into the Atlantic Ocean. He inspired a group of men called the Lollards, and the Lollards were the poor priests. And they established what was really the first home Bible studies. And they would go from village to village, ministering to the poor, bringing the Bible with them and studying it in their own language, which was quite revolutionary at that time. Wycliffe has inspired people even still today. There's a group of people called the Wycliffe Bible Translators, and they go throughout the whole world trying to translate the Bible in as many languages as possible. Wycliffe has sent us 2 Bibles. This one was the original Bible that they made for the country of Vanuatu, and this was written to a dialect of people in the Philippines that they translated for them so that they could have the Bible in their own language. Their work is still going on today. Then probably one of the more famous people in association with the Bible is Johann Gutenberg. Gutenberg created what is called the movable type printing press. He had this idea that he wanted to do an artificial writing apparatus. And so he poured all his effort, energy, and money into this printing press. In fact, he borrowed so much money that he was never going to ever be able to pay it back. When the first Bible came off of the printing press, his partner at the time called in the debt. Of course, Gutenberg was not able to pay his partner, and so his partner repossessed the shop, the printing press, and all of the Bibles that had come off of the press. And so Gutenberg ends up having to go back home to Mainz in Germany, where he dies penniless, destitute, and alone. The irony of it is that today, if he would be able to go and sell one of his Bibles, he'd be able to pay off his debt many times over. It is a beautiful Bible. It's also called the 42-line Bible, and it's beautifully illustrated and written in Latin. That brings us to a man by the name of Erasmus. Erasmus was a priest and a Greek scholar who took the Latin Vulgate and put it side by side with the Greek. He wanted to show the weaknesses of the Latin Vulgate and to go back to the original language of the Greek. His work would become known as Textus Receptus. It would be used by Luther and Tyndale and the King James translators in order to fill in some gaps for his Bible. Erasmus was a guy who loved to be alone. He loved to be by himself. In fact, he said, when I get a little money, I buy books. And if there's any left over, then I'll buy food and clothes. And so he was a very witty guy, had some quotes that we still know today, and his work was absolutely influential. Then in 1522, Luther begins to work on a New Testament into German. Now, this happened after Martin Luther accidentally starts the Protestant Reformation. And we do mean accidentally. When he nailed his 95 Theses upon the door of the Wittenberg church, he was really going after the Archbishop of Wittenberg at the time. He never really was starting a Protestant Reformation, but it was like a spark to a powder keg. And once he let that spark, then everything blew up and he ran with it. In the midst of that, he saw that the Bible needed to be written in German for his people, and so he did a translation of that and created a beautiful piece of work. He inspired many, many people, and he directly inspires a man by the name of William Tyndale. William Tyndale is known as the father of the English Bible. He is a priest and an Oxford scholar, but very much a rebel. And he would often preach against the Pope and the atrocities that was going on at that time. Now, he began work on the Bible in English because he saw what Luther had done with German. And he was, at first, was able to do most of his work left alone, but he had a secretary. And his secretary had loose lips. And he was letting everybody know what was going on. And as a result, William Tyndale is caught and he is arrested and was going to be on trial. Henry VIII has ascended to the throne by this time. He is split with the Catholic Church. And so Henry VIII sends word to the king asking for leniency, asking that they let William Tyndale go. The problem is that Henry VIII had just recently got rid of his first wife, Catherine. And when he got rid of Catherine, Catherine was the aunt of the king that he was writing to. So as you can imagine, he was not real acceptable to Henry VIII's suggestions and ended up strangling and burning William Tyndale to the stake. That brings us to Miles Coverdale. Miles Coverdale secured his place in history by becoming the very first person to print the complete Bible in English. Now, Coverdale himself said that it was not an easy read, that it was not his best work, but when you're first, you have the greatest claim over things. And so he began his work. It was a very literal translation, but it did become very difficult to read for the common people. And in fact, his work at first caught on, but he ran into the Henry VIII syndrome. The cover page was dedicated to the Queen. Of course, shortly after it was published, then of course Henry VIII had got rid of that queen and got a new queen, Anne Boleyn at that time. And so when he did that, then of course the Henry VIII would went through quite a few wives, and so he was never able to gain traction on his Bible. But his friend, John Rogers, actually did an incredible work. He was the opposite of Coverdale. Coverdale was a politician at heart, even though he never held a political office. However, John Rogers was on the run for his life most of his time of translation. In fact, he had to change his name to Thomas Matthew, and he created what is known as the Matthew's Bible. It is a beautiful work. In fact, Coverdale preferred Matthew's Bible even over his own because of the language and because how what a good work that he had done. Now, Henry VIII had later on had ordered that there would be a Bible in every parish, and they all had the same Bible. It became known as the Great Bible. It was big, it was beautiful, people loved it, they loved to look at it, and they loved to have it, even though it was not really commonly available to the average person. And so what they would do was they would break into the churches and they would steal the Bibles. Evidently, they had not yet read the 10 Commandments where it said, "Thou shalt not steal." And so what they had to end up doing was chaining the Bible to the pulpits and to the lecterns so that people would stop stealing the Bible. In 1557, William Whittingham completes a new revision of the New Testament shortly after he does the Old Testament, and he creates what is known as the First Study Bible. The First Study Bible has summaries at the beginning of each book in order to let you know what the book is about, as well as commentaries. Now, William Whittingham's brother-in-law was John Calvin. So you can imagine that the commentaries had a Calvinistic slant to them. He also had cross-references, which was unusual at the time. And it became the go-to Bible of its day. Everybody preferred the Geneva Bible over all the other Bibles. One of the reasons for this was because it is the first Bible in the New Testament especially to have verse divisions, had verse numbers. We have William Whittingham to thank for John 3:16, because otherwise it would just be, that verse in John somewhere. And so William Whittingham completes verse divisions, and this becomes the Bible of the Puritans. It becomes the Bible of William Shakespeare, of John Bunyan, of many great people of the day. In fact, at one point, Henry VIII has ordered that every house in England have a Bible and on display. And in fact, they would come in, they would inspect it to make sure they had their Bible. If they didn't, they had a stiff fine that they had to pay. This was the Bible of choice for most people, was the Geneva Bible. In 1563, Archbishop Parker was selected as chief editor in order to make a new translation. Archbishop Parker had initially had been Calvinistic in his theology, but after reading more and more scripture, he had gone away from Calvinism and wanted a new Bible in order that would go away from the Calvinistic leanings of theology. It would be established within the churches, and so 8 bishops were assigned beneath him in order to do the work of the translation. His work never really caught on. However, it did provide the source material for one of the greatest works that would ever be published. Well, in this wave of many, many Bibles being written at this time, and this is just a few of them, the Roman Catholic Church had still been very staunchly saying that the Bible should only be written in Latin, read in Latin, studied in Latin. But by the time all these Bibles come around, they finally relent a little bit, and they decide to do their own translation based upon the Latin Vulgate. And so Gregory Martin was selected along with his partner to work together into creating a new translation that would be from the Latin Vulgate. And the work that he did was very significant. It really changed the course of the Catholic Church at that time. His work is scholarly, it's beautiful, and very, very valuable. Then there was a man by the name of King James the Sixth of Scotland. His mother was Mary, Queen of Scots, who we also know as Bloody Mary. She had to abdicate the throne. She was forced from the throne, and he was given the throne of England, which he becomes King James I. On his very first week as being king, he was given a letter of grievances signed by 1,000 Puritan leaders on how they had been treated, especially by the Anglican Church. It was very well known that King James did not like the Puritans. However, he did not care much for the Anglicans for stirring this up, especially in his early reign as king. And so he calls the Hampton Court Conference. And in the Hampton Court Conference, there's yelling and screaming and back and forth. And so he gets up and he stops all of it and he says these words: "I have never yet read a good translation of the Bible, and the worst of them all is the Geneva Bible." And with that, a new translation was to be born. He selected men from the major universities of that time to work on this. And then they came together. Their requirement was, first of all, their source material had to be the bishop's Bible. And so they would use the bishop's Bible. Now, what's interesting is that we call it the King James Version. Now, King James actually never authorized the version. He commissioned it for it to be done. We don't know why he never authorized it, but he didn't. Also, it's not a translation. It's a revision. It's a revision of the bishop's Bible, which, by the way, was a revision of the Great Bible, which, by the way, is a revision of Tyndale's Bible. And so we're talking about that the King James is a revision of a revision of a revision of a translation. And so, but the work that they did was incredible. It is not understating it to say that it changed the world. However, it did not really gain good acceptance until after 1644. And 1644 was the last update to the Geneva Bible, so it starts to wane in popularity as the King James Version starts to gain popularity. It changes the English language. We get popular phrases today: by the skin of one's own teeth, the land of the living, turn the world upside down, God forbid, the powers that be, the blind leading the blind, and many others. It popularized all those phrases. All those phrases, by the way, were invented by William Tyndale. Now, the King James Version that we have today is not the 1611 King James Version. It is the 1769. Which is a revision of the revision, and we could go on all the way back to Tyndale again. But there was over 75,000 changes that were made from the 1769 to the 1611. No great theology was changed. It didn't affect much of anything except for words and spellings that had changed over time. In 1881, a bunch of British scholars got together and decided that they needed an update to the King James Version, a new translation. And so they got together in order to make what is known as the English Revised Version. They had invited many American scholars to come together in order to help work on the English Revised Version. The only requirement that they had was that for 14 years, they were not allowed to do their own translation. So the American scholars eagerly accepted the requirements and began work on this English Revised Version. However, every suggestion that they made based on translation, whether it be word order, word spelling, whatever it may be, the British would never accept any of their suggestions. And so exactly 14 years later, they create what is known as the American Standard Bible. Now, they did the most American thing ever, was that in between the Old and the New Testament, they have an appendix. And in the appendix, they put in there the differences between the English Revised Version and the American Standard Version. Basically, it's all the suggestions that they made that the British people, the British scholars, soundly rejected.